Welcome to the Social Service Workforce webinar series brought to you by the Global Social Service Workforce Alliance through funding from the United States President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief and the United States Agency for International Development to the For Children Project, implemented by a consortium of organizations and led by Catholic Relief Services. I am Amy Bess, the Director of the Alliance. Today's session is the 25th webinar in our series and is focused on our recently released State of the Social Service Workforce report. We'll review its findings related to ways that the social service workforce achieves positive outcomes for families affected by violence. In the webinar today, I will provide a little bit of background and context for the report. Then Elena Ganatakis, who is the consultant and lead author of the report, will review the report methodologies and key findings. And then Salim Bukhari, who is a health education officer and social worker in the health department in Punjab, Pakistan, will discuss his work that was captured in the report about ways that he addresses violence against children. I'll then wrap up with a quick summary of the recommendations outlined in the report. And then our presentations will be followed by a Q&A session moderated by Nicole Brown, who is the communications manager of the Alliance. So we encourage you to be thinking of your questions along the way and ask them at the end of the presentations. Also, just so you all know, the slides and recording of today's webinar will be posted to the Alliance website early next week and will also be circulated in our next e-update to members. Next slide. With the webinar today, we are launching our 2017 report that features stories about social service workforce efforts to address violence against children. The Sustainable Development Goals outline strategies for countries to end poverty and improve the lives of children and families by addressing health, education, justice, migration, and protection from violence. By committing to achieving the SDGs by 2013, UN member states commit to these goals related to child well-being and protection. These goals cannot be achieved without a strong and locally based social service workforce. But we find that there can be limited understanding of the important and valuable role the social service workforce plays in preventing and responding to violence. So we set out to have the 2017 report help improve understanding of the role of social service workers in preventing and addressing violence against children. We hope that this report will help to advance that causal link between the strength of the social service workforce and positive outcomes for children and families by using the storytelling and narrative analysis approach. And the report demonstrates the value of multidisciplinary approaches to addressing violence and emphasizes the key role that social service workers play in facilitating this approach. So there have been many recent reports that have captured the severity of the situation of violence against children across the world. If you can go to the next slide. The statistics can be staggering and provide a context that emphasizes the dire need for interventions from a strong workforce. In the report, we feature statistics on physical violence, sexual violence, emotional violence, and neglect. We drew from reports such as Inspire, the 7 Strategies for Ending Violence Against Children, also UNICEF's 2014 Hidden in Plain Sight technical report, the 2017 No Violence in Childhood Global Report, and the 2006 World Report on Violence Against Children, as well as the many VAC studies and many others that have recently been written. We know that violence affects children of all ages and in a wide range of contexts across the globe. For example, half of all children in the world have been affected by some form of violence. 60 to 70% of boys and girls experience emotional abuse by a caregiver or other household member between the ages of 2 and 14. There are also multiple social and economic costs associated with violence against children. Evidence supports the cost effectiveness of preventing violence against children, and yet current levels of government spending remain very low, particularly when it comes to investing in the workforce. So the Alliance has been fortunate over time to work with so many social service workers and experts around the globe over the past few years. If you can go to the next slide. And with this wide array of expertise over time, we've developed this definition of the social service workforce that you see on this slide, and that you're probably all very familiar with at this point, having contributed to this definition as well. But often the general public and other professionals in other fields do not always understand who the social service workforce is and what their role is. And we felt that narratives really help to improve this understanding, especially when those narratives describe what the social service workforce does and how they work with children and families experiencing violence. So the stories included in this 2017 report of how workers have helped children and families helps to bring their work to life and raises awareness about their role. So let me go ahead and introduce today's first speaker. Elena has a master's in public health and is the lead author of the 2017 State of the Social Service Workforce Report. She has 14 years of experience in social science research, technical writing, and storytelling on global health issues, and has previously produced 2 documentaries on violence against children in South Africa. So Elena, I'll hand the mic over to you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, great. So thank you, Amy. I'm going to be giving an overview of the methodology associated with the report and describe the key results. Next slide, please. This is a description of the methods that were used in the report. First, we conducted a document review that included peer-reviewed literature, technical reports, conference reports, NGO and other organizational reports and grade literature. Then we conducted a survey to gather data from the social service workforce in different contexts. I'm going to provide more detail on the survey in a moment. And once we collected the data, we conducted qualitative thematic analysis on the survey responses. And this involved identifying and analyzing the themes that emerged for each question and tallying up the responses in Excel. And finally, we created profiles from selected stories and followed up with respondents to obtain more information on their stories. Next slide, please. This is a summary of the 4 categories of information that we collected through the questionnaire. We collected information about profiles, work, perceptions of support, and finally, we asked each respondent to tell a story of a particular case that they had worked on. Next slide, please. There were a number of limitations to this analysis, but despite these limitations, there was still insight to be gained from the collective feedback and perceptions of social service workers globally. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk about some of the key results. We received the completed questionnaires from 53 respondents across 29 countries. The respondents had described 16 different roles that they had, ranging from direct service provision to management to organizational leadership. Respondents described 6 different types of employers, from academic and research institutions to NGOs, civil society, government, UN agencies, and professional associations. Most of the respondents worked in a combination of settings, and when asked about what was the key motivating factor for their work, the overwhelming majority of respondents described their desire to help people, and quite a number of respondents also described their own personal experiences with abuse as the key motivating factor for their involvement in this work. Next slide, please. Respondents had a range of education and training. It's notable that 66% had a bachelor's degree or higher. Also notable was the fact that many respondents, in addition to other forms of education, reported obtaining additional recognized certifications in a range of topics. Next slide, please. Respondents reported an average of Respondents reported an average of 13.5 cases a month that involved violence that they were working on, and this constituted 73% of their caseload. Respondents described 13 different types of violence against children encountered in their work. The most common types of violence were sexual violence, physical violence, neglect, psychological and emotional violence, and child labor as well. About half of the respondents mentioned, in addition to their caseload, involvement in community awareness raising and sensitization campaigns related to violence against children. Next slide, please. This is a summary of the types of services that respondents describe providing to children and families affected by violence. Respondents reported providing 17 different types of services, with the most frequently reported as social work, counseling, family assessments and casework, psychosocial support, and linkage and referral to other services. Next slide, please. More than half of the respondents described feeling adequately prepared and supported for their work. A number of those that described feeling adequately prepared and supported, though, also cited specific concerns and additional needs, and about a quarter of the respondents expressed feelings of inadequate preparation, and they cited specific challenges which are listed on this slide, some of which were a lack of transport, a shortage of financial and human resources, a need for more education and training, particularly trauma counseling, and navigating the social cultural challenges with recognizing violence against children in the, at the community and interpersonal level. Next slide, please. When asked about the most helpful types of support for their work, respondents described increasing the availability of support services to children and families, and they talked about having more services related to counseling or therapy, case management, psychosocial support, and legal support, as well as more awareness within families and communities. They also described support for workers themselves, such as training and capacity building, more supervision, higher compensation, reduced workload, and finally, coordination was also mentioned quite frequently as a potentially helpful form of support, including coordination and collaboration between stakeholders and knowledge sharing. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the respondents were asked to describe a story of a child or family dealing with violence that they helped. And we did an analysis across the different stories to identify the common themes. Sexual violence was the most commonly described type of violence that emerged through these stories, as well as physical violence and neglect. 1/3 of the stories featured a child or children experiencing multiple forms of violence. And another very prominent theme was the role that social service workers play as not only the direct support they provide to children and families, but also their role as facilitators with different collaborators. And on the right of this slide, this shows the different collaborators that the social service workforce respondents collaborated with to provide services to children and families. Next slide, please. This is a summary of the major challenges that the respondents described in their stories: institutional inadequacies, institutions reluctant or slow to act, involving too many actors without coordination and communication between them, staff that aren't equipped to communicate and deal with children, and lack of critical reporting structures, negative parental attitudes, negative children's behaviors. Silence and fear of disclosure was another major challenge. This is when children and families refused or declined to report or press formal charges because of stigma or fear associated with sharing or reporting the case. And finally, another major challenge was local cultures and traditions, which were perceived by some workers as barriers to handling cases. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes what worked well in the cases that respondents described. Respondents described the strength of families, the loving relationships, the willingness for families to cooperate and provide support to other family members, and also the willingness and motivation to get involved in family interventions. They also described family strengthening work, and this was coaching, raising awareness, and facilitating successful relationships within families. Another aspect that worked well was building a connection and relationship with children and families, developing trust, maintaining confidentiality, and offering consistent support, working in partnerships, coordinating between government and private agencies and other actors to assess children's needs and provide services. And finally, providing referrals for multidisciplinary services for families to address diverse but often interrelated needs. Next slide. When asked what they thought helped them the most in working with the child or family affected by violence in their story, respondents identified worker-related factors as the most helpful factor, and these included things such as good training, development of specific skills, and continued training and education. Next slide. This slide summarizes the key outcomes. This slide just really highlights the importance of the work that the social service workforce is doing. These are the positive changes that workers bring about, and lasting changes in families. Increased self-esteem, self-worth, and morale of children, family strengthening, strengthen family relationships, building parenting skills and increasing parental awareness, transforming communities, facilitating dialogue within communities to help them understand and communicate about different forms of violence against children, and how communities can provide greater support, educational achievement. This is integrating children or reintegrating children back into school to continue their education and support children with educational needs. And finally, another key outcome was coordinated provision of multi-sectoral services. Respondents described clients benefiting from various services such as health and nutrition, shelter, birth certificates, and helping clients to become empowered to earn income and to support themselves and their families. And I'm going to hand it back to Amy.
Thank you, Elena, for such a comprehensive presentation about some of the findings and the methodology of the report. And if anyone has questions about that part of the presentation, hold them or feel free to type them in now, and we'll address them at the end of the presentations. So now let me introduce Salim Bukhari. He has a Master's of Social Work and is a Health Education Officer in the Health Department in the Government of Punjab, Pakistan. Working in a hospital setting, Salim provides counseling to children and families affected by physical and sexual violence and works with parents, community leaders, and professionals on child protection. He's conducted the first soon-to-be-published study on the prevalence of child abuse in Pakistan. Salim is one of the workers who was profiled in the 2017 report, and he will share more about the role of medical social workers in helping to address violence against children, the challenges that he faces in Pakistan, and some of the steps being taken to better protect children in Pakistan. So thank you, and I'll now hand the microphone over to Salim.
Thank you so much, Amy. You already introduced me. So without wasting time, I would like to go to the next slide about my work. So please change the slide. Basically, I'm providing counseling to the abused children and their parents and helping engaging the community in the process of helping those people who are those children who are sexually abused and their parents who are going through some sort of trauma. Beside this, I am providing multidisciplinary training to the professionals who are working with children. Specifically, these trainings are being provided to the medical professional. I'm also conducting awareness seminars on child rights, and these seminars are basically addressing the general community, professionals, social workers, parents, and the people involved in helping children. Moreover, as you have mentioned, I have conducted the first pioneer study in Pakistan regarding prevalence of child abuse. Moreover, I am also conducting two other studies regarding risk factor of child abuse within family, and I am also conducting the analysis of reported cases of child sexual abuse in Pakistan to look into the matters, to look into the cases that what are those factors which are you can say causing sexual abuse, or what are the you can say social characteristics of people are victims who are being sexually abused. Next slide, please. So this is about state of child protection in specifically in Punjab, Pakistan. There is a little beyond the slogan of rights, and few interventions are being taken so far. Mostly when high-profile cases surface in media, a cosmetic sort of work is done for the sake of political mileage. Although Pakistan is a CRC signatory country, means Convention on the Rights of Child is signed by Pakistan. Though, but little work is done so far. I would like to give a legislation brief about it. Beside the Constitution of Pakistan, there is a National Commission on Rights of Child. We have Child Marriage Restraint Act 1929, Punjab Prohibition of Child Labor and Bricklaying Act 2016 is also there. Restriction on Employment of Children Act 2016 is also here. Punjab Free and Compulsory Education Act 2014, Punjab Reproductive, Maternal, Neonatal and Child Health Authority Act 2014, and Destitute and Neglected Children Act 2014, 2004, Punjab Juvenile System Rules 2002. Moreover, Child Protection and Welfare Bureau is also functioning in 7 cities of Punjab. Uh, Model orphanage, child orphanage is also operating under you can say social welfare department. In December 2017, first child court was established in Lahore, Pakistan by Justice Mansoor Ali Shah. Next slide, please. Violence against children in Punjab, specifically the statistics which I obtained from my study, which are based on my prevalence study, which I just mentioned. This study was basically conducted by using ICAST-R, you can say a tool to conduct cross-sectional study on prevalence of child abuse. It was developed by UNICEF, United Nations, and ISPACAN. According to the findings of this study, 57% of children were physically abused, 53% are you can say emotionally abused, and sexual abuse is reported by 41% of children. And the most severe form of sexual abuse, which is you can say intercourse, that was reported by 8% of respondents. According to findings of this study, most frequent reported perpetrators in the cases of physical abuse were parents and children, and in the cases of emotional abuse, again these were parents and children, and in the cases of sexual abuse, peers and neighbor were the highest reported perpetrator. A highest reported age span, according to the study, was you can say 10 to 15 years, and overall, by including all 20 subtypes of abuse, 81% of respondents reported at least one form of abuse. In gender perspective, male were highest reported as compared to the female respondents. Next, please. Next slide, please. This is you can say brief overview, a sketch of my study findings. If someone is interested to you can say go through the detail, it can be viewed. Next, please. This is a case study of child sexual abuse, which you can say I counsel this child and family in hospital. This is you can say a typical modern study through which you can assess that what are the situation regarding such sort of cases. A 10-year-old male child was brought to the hospital by his mother. The child was having high fever and in state of shock and emotional trauma, and child was very much frightened. According to the mother, child refused to go outside in schools. Health, eating patterns, sleeping, interacting patterns of child were very much affected. I asked the mother to share in detail with me what happened to the child. Initially, mother was very much reluctant, and it seemed she was not. She was trying to hide, but ultimately, on you can say rapport building and empathic expressions and assurance of help and confidentiality, she revealed the trauma through which child and family were going. Mother revealed that child was being followed past sexual commands and touched by a person aged approximately 35 years. That person wanted to establish sexual relations with child, and he used to call the child as his beloved. Mother was not willing to report the matter to police or to some institution due to family repute, fear of enmity, lack of trust in police, stigma, future of the child, and bringing it in the knowledge of husband may cause his anger and further deterioration of family repute and establishing enmity. His uh, his husband was serving his military in another city. The child was given medical treatment. Next, please. And I counsel the child through rapport building, by establishing rapport building and asking him about his friends, his games, his toys, and the sports he prefers, and thus then ask about the incident in open-ended way to let him express his fears. Besides this, I assured the child that we shall try our best to help him bring out of this trauma and this troubling situation. I asked the mother to bring child for subsequent sessions of counseling to help child for coming out of trauma. Child explored, child revealed the uh, issues which was already shared by mother. I approached an influential community leader for helping the you can say family, because mother was not willing to report the case due to specific situation. Then you can say apprehension and fear. I approached a community leader for helping the family, who that person had some local contacts with some local police and administration. I requested that person to help the family. That person volunteered and acting accordingly by mobilizing the few other community leaders and adults who were ready and volunteered to help. The matter was resolved, and the perpetrators was warned to be expelled from the community, threatened to be handed over to the police. This alliance created by that community leader and community and surveillance on that perpetrator protected the you can say community, protected the family and child from further cycle of abuse. Next, please. So in that specific case, I you can say I asked the mother to come for further subsequent session, which she followed, and later on it was revealed by mother the child was little improving from the situation, although still he was in trauma. Going to the causes of child sexual abuse, causes include lack of deterrence because institutions are not so strong to pursue the cases in such a way to bring the culprit or apprehend the culprit in you can say appropriate manners. Moreover, culturally influenced parent patterns are also there, which allow the parents and teachers to beat the child or physically you can say do violence with children. So it is already proven by the studies that children who are being physically beaten are more at risk of sexual abuse than children who. Another factor is neglect and lack of supervision, which can lead to abuse. Low and no reporting is also there, which is because of shame, stigma, family repute, absence of services, lack of training of staff, social pressures, threats, withdrawal from the cases, legal flaws, institutional and procedural lapses, lack of sensitization of community, and disintegrated services. Next, please. So the practical issues and challenges. Reported cases are basically a tip of iceberg, as it is you can say revealed, and this especially the scarcity of data is the main obstacle in understanding the nature of situation and the you can say nature of cases. Hard work on issues. It is really hard to work on the issues which are covered in denial and taboos. Community denies the existence of sexual abuse, and it is maintained that this is basically a Western problem. Such sort of problem does not exist in our community. Culturally influencing parenting patterns in which children are witnessing complexity of intimate partner violence, where children are witnessing the violence, extended families, and violence within families are, you can say, challenges for tackling. No social worker and psychologist report is, you can say, included in medical legal process. Institutions are not child friendly and staff is untrained. In most of the cases, I have personally observed that even children are blamed for, you can say, specific cases of child sexual abuse, and children are declared, you can say, guilty, that they are responsible for it. Such is the situation, our response of even from some professionals who are working with children. Conviction rate in the cases of female child sexual abuse, according to the 2016 prosecution department data, which I was reviewing, out of 222 cases, only three cases, you can say, culprit or you can say perpetrators were tried in the presence of sufficient evidences and complete legal requirement, which stands 1.3% conviction rate. Next, please. Professional social workers' role in child cases of child sexual abuse. Although social work discipline has its nascent stage, and social workers are not involved in the procedures regarding dealing the cases of child sexual abuse, and there are very few hospitals in medical where medical social workers or case workers are appointed. But even then, social workers can play their role for establishing the trails for the people to come by counseling the parents and children, by documenting whatever they are doing and recording it, by reporting it to the relevant forums and places and universities, by devising some strategies and sharing the leaves, sharing the those trails for the people to follow. This is the, you can say, situation where we can establish, you can say, culture of working with children, a culture of involving the social work. Casework approach, which is the strength of social workers, is a professional approach which is specifically helpful in the cases of child sexual abuse, and we can benefit from this approach by availing the resources whichever are available in our vicinity and are in our services. Next, please. This is, you can say, these are the typical examples of some other cases beyond child sexual abuse. On the left side, this is child which was burnt and while the child was standing near stove and neglected by the mother. Shirt of the child was burnt and it burned the belly of child as well. On right side, you can see a small child which was, you can say, neglected and given up while the parents came in hospital, and later on we announced and parents came to receive the child. Next, please. This is, you can say, typical example of intimate partner violence in which this child lost teeth and it was brought in hospital for treatment. Next, please. So the way forward, what needs to be done, the first need is data for understanding the clear situation of child abuse and all the factors which are involved, so as to inform the policy makers and people who are working with children. Removing the legal flaws, another step. Inclusion of child-specific material in social work education for clear understanding of the people and social work professionals who are working with children or who opt to work with children. Inclusion of social workers in handling cases of child abuse, so as to include their report, because social workers have specific strength and it can help in improving the process of, you can say, justice. Training of professionals who are working with children. I have seen in many situations that the professionals who are working with children are not good at communicating with children, and there is need to train the people and professional in communication process with children, because children communicate in their own way. Awareness campaigns are needed to break the taboos and to bring the community out of denial. Positive parenting workshops are needed to help the parents in, you can say, dealing with their children. There is need to establish child-friendly model institution where from medical legal to interviewing on all sort of process is being provided, all sort of services are being provided under one roof. Next, please. So this was all about you could say child cases of situation of child abuse in Pakistan. Thank you so much, Amy and the team, for providing me opportunity to share my experiences.
Great. Thank you so much, Salim, for sharing your insight and experience. As those who are listening who've seen the report probably recognize, we're walking through the various stages of the report or sections of the report. And I think it's just really, it's valuable to hear in more detail one of the stories and that's featured in the report and the really wide breadth of expertise and experience that is involved in each and every one of the stories. So thank you again, Salim, for sharing that. Then the other final section of the report that we're walking through is one on implications and way forward. And we drew from the outcomes of the stories and available literature and research to highlight and feature some of the key implications. So thanks for advancing the slide. The stories emphasized, and we know from research that it's important to ensure that workers are prepared and trained for their various roles. The report and the stories submitted really drive home the point that workers carry out a very diverse array of functions. Working with families and communities affected by violence requires a very broad skill set. As Elena mentioned, for most respondents in this report, only a portion of their caseload is comprised of families affected by violence. And they have a lot of other issues and issues that they're helping families and communities to address. So with this wide range of responsibilities is also a wide range of skills that's required. So training needs to be accessible and available to workers, and it needs to be linked to the key micro, meso, and macro functions and competencies that are needed to carry out this work. And it needs to emphasize a strength-based, culturally competent approach, which we heard echoed across each and every one of the stories. Another key implication is that social service workers need to be provided with ongoing support to increase motivation, retention, and performance. Respondents noted that this support can come in the form of professional supervision, career advancement opportunities, effective organizational leadership, and availability of tools and resources needed to carry out the work. In addition, some mentioned the importance of addressing secondary trauma. And we know from the literature that incorporating a caring for the caregivers approach into the organizational culture can effectively support worker well-being and retention. So we also recognize the need to incorporate the role of the social service workforce into legislative and policy frameworks, particularly recognizing their important role as coordinators of multi-sectoral collaboration, and that came out in what Elena was presenting. We need to recognize the value of utilizing not only quantitative but also qualitative data to build the evidence base for workforce strengthening. There's real value in carrying out mapping exercises and identifying the numbers of workers and education available and a lot of the key data. But we've also found that combining that with a storytelling approach can provide a much richer evidence base for this work. And we hear again and again that increasing the accessibility and availability of services to children and families affected by violence enables workers to provide and link to a more comprehensive array of services that better support families and prevent and respond to violence. So more details about all of these points are included in the report. And we do want to leave time for questions and answers from those of you who are participating in the webinar. So I will now hand over to Nicole, who will be moderating the Q&A. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Amy, Elena, and Salim for that very interesting and informative presentation. The data in the report, while it points to a significant crisis and problem with violence against children and families being affected overall, stories like Salim's and others in the report, as well as the work that many of you on this webinar are doing, give us great hope that achievement of SDG 16.2 to end violence in all forms is possible and will happen by 2030. So thank you again. We'd now like to open it up to questions. We invite all of you to type your questions into the chat box. I do see that several of you have raised your hand, but you are on mute. Everyone is muted. So we ask that you type your questions and we will relay the questions to the presenters. And we now have about 15 minutes to answer all of your questions. So again, please type those into the chat box now. And as you're typing your questions, we can address any questions related to the data, the methodology of the report, some of the stories, and as well as implications going forward. So we'll give you a few minutes to type your questions. We have received one question, Amy or Elena, if you want to address it, about the geographical representation of respondents and what countries or regions responded to the questionnaires and are included within the report.
Hi, Nicole. That's a question for me.
You or Amy, sure.
Okay. Sure. I can answer that. So there were 53 countries representing a lot of different continents. Would you like me to read the countries or just talk about what continents? What would be the best?
I think a quick overview would probably be fine.
Okay. Great. Actually, Amy, I'm just trying to find my document that that has that information. Would you be able to answer that more quickly?
Sure. Yes, and for those of you who are interested in following along, it's on page 16 of the report. There were a number of respondents from the Americas and Bolivia and Colombia, Guatemala, Ecuador, from Eastern and Central Europe, from Eastern and Southern Africa is probably where the majority, or not the majority, but the largest number of stories came from. We had one story from Jordan in the Middle East, and a number of stories from South and Southeast Asia, from Pakistan, from the Philippines, from Indonesia, as well as a number of other countries in the region, and from West and Central Africa as well. So it was a fairly diverse array of countries represented by those 53 stories. I think there are about 27 countries.
Great, thank you. And we also have a question about some of the implications for the workforce strengthening in the final section of the report and at the end of your presentation, Amy, on are there any specific steps and tips provided on how to increase motivation, retention, and performance?
Yeah, there were. I think for everything from emphasizing the importance of supportive supervision, which is also very backed up by the evidence base, that having things like at least weekly meetings with a supervisor, or having a very structured peer support modality in place, an opportunity, especially when working with really challenging cases, for workers to come together with colleagues, whether it's peers or supervisors, to really talk through maintaining confidentiality, but to talk through the challenges of the cases and to not feel like they're alone trying to make these very monumental decisions or recommendations to a particular family that's finding themselves in the middle of crisis. And having that that peer support is very valuable. We also heard a little bit about the importance of training, not only in terms of feeling confident and competent, but also in terms of having a sense of some upward mobility or career trajectory, and that helps maintain retention in the field in general, so that people don't gather all these skills and have this great work experience and then go to work somewhere else because they don't see a future, or because they get burned out because they're not kind of talking through their experiences. So those are two of the main areas that were emphasized. Just this real kind of caring for the caregivers, addressing secondary trauma, discussing the difficulty of cases through supportive supervision and peer counseling.
Great, thank you. And we've gotten several additional questions. One is asking about physical disciplinary action by parents and caregivers, and when it's termed abuse, and are there any, I guess, instances in some of these cultures where that's not called abuse?
I wonder, Salim, would you like to address that in the hospital setting?
Let me see if Salim. Hi, Salim. Did you want to answer that question?
Yeah. Please repeat the question.
The question is asking when physical disciplinary action by parents or caregivers is deemed abuse, and when in some of the settings like you deal with, it's not called abuse.
Well, in specific cultural setting of Pakistan, I would like to give that what is called abuse and what is called not abuse. You can say in community, basically you could say whenever a parent or teacher is dealing with the children, I would like to give a specific situation in my study in which I was asking a mother that do you beat your child? She said, yes, I used to beat my child. I asked why you beat your child. Is it useful to beat the child? She said, no, it is not useful to beat the child, even it is not, you could say, working regarding discipline. So I asked, then why do you beat the child? She said, she replied, even she questioned, then what I should do? Means parents are not aware of alternative discipline techniques, and this is considered as a disciplining techniques to beat the child, and even it is in community, it is accepted as beating a child. So whenever I ask that why, what is the limitation that where you should not beat the child, mostly parents say that it should not be beaten in such a way that children are physically injured. Means injury is you can say borderline or mark where you can say parents consider that here we should stop. A child should not bleed, our bone should not be you can say deformed, and this is the pattern where it was in practice in schools as well, although it is legislated to prohibit the teachers from beating. Is it enough to you can say answer the question?
Yes, thanks, Salim. Well, if that individual has additional questions, please type them in the chat box. We have a question, Amy, about the data and the reporting. And does the data include families across socioeconomic statuses within countries? And does it link those, if it does break it down in that manner, does it link directly to the SDG goals? And those goals particular to economic statuses and countries?
Yeah, it's a good question. As part of the questionnaire, we did not ask about the socioeconomic status of the family, but in terms of the countries represented and how they fall within, for example, the World Bank classification of low and middle income and high income countries, there is a representation across those three different categories. We have some lower income countries, middle income countries, and higher income countries that reported, that provided some of the stories that went into the report. There are a number of countries that reported, that we have cases reported from that that are Pathfinder countries, for example, that have committed to addressing violence against children to achieve SDG 16.2. So there is a pretty broad representation in that sense. I don't know if that answers the question, but feel free to clarify if it hasn't.
Great, thank you. And Salim, this may be a question best addressed by you. Suresh has typed a question that he is with a group of 22 social work students at a university in India, and they're asking how, in a country where religion and taboo and other issues come into play in dealing with some of these cases, how do you detect sexual and physical violence, and how do, as a social worker and others in the social service workforce, address these issues and overcome them?
Yeah. Well, it is, you can say, really a tough question, and specifically, I have already mentioned in the country like Islamic Republic of Pakistan, Armenian community, where you can say this is a taboo and it is denied, that it does not exist in our society. It is really hard, and the cases which are of very severe nature mostly are reported. For example, the cases in which children are you can say abused in such a manner that it becomes you can say very much necessary to report these cases. For example, in one case, the child was crying out of pain, and the mother was, you can say, was not willing to report that case or to bring the child to hospital, but the painful cries of child, you can say, brought situation to such a, you can say, corner where the mother was forced to bring the child to the hospital. So there she revealed that this was this, you can say, traumatic situation through which child was going. So what I mean that it is really hard, and very few cases are reported from the sexual abuse because of you can say denial, and because of the discouragement in the community, that people are discouraged to talk about on these issues. And even media, very less cases are reported in media. So this is really hard, and especially for social workers, it is really hard to you can say engage the community or parents for working on these issues.
Yeah, if I could also add, I think that it's very fortunate that Salim is in the hospital and has the social work skills to kind of go beyond just the health response, but to talk with the families about what's happening and then to help them address it once they're released from the hospital. And it's such an important role. There's also one of the things that came out of a lot of the stories and that we know in general from research on the workforce is that a large portion of their job is focused on community-based awareness raising. They have a certain, a caseload of cases of families and children who've been affected by violence. But, and Salim, you've mentioned this in your story as well, almost every worker reported an element of their work is focused on prevention and focused on discussions with the community about taboos and social norms and kind of the sources of violence and how to address those and prevent violence. So I also just want to emphasize, I think that's a really important role. And when we think about training for the workforce, really focusing on community organization and community mobilization, awareness raising, as well as these specific casework skills. And so that's when we talk about the micro, meso, macro skills needed by social service workers. It really is important. And I think in Salim's stories, he's emphasized, even as a hospital social worker, kind of the way that someone can be engaged in all of those various areas.
Thank you. And we have a question from Michael in Gabon about their best practices. He relays there that social workers are part of the child protection system, and each case is supposed to be managed in a systematic approach involving magistrates, police officers, religious leaders, others in the NGOs, and that approach has changed the quality of the response there in dealing with violence against children. But are there best practices or guidelines that have been laid out as to who should make up these teams in different countries and in contexts? It's a tough question. Amy, do you want to attempt to address that?
Sure, I think it is a common question, and one actually, if some of you are familiar with our work on case management, the Alliance has formed and established a case management interest group and developed some core principles and guidelines for case management. And the group has been talking about next steps now that these kind of foundational documents have been produced by the group. And one of the next steps is to really tease out this multi-sectoral coordination and to look at examples from different countries. There are a lot of good examples out there and good practices that different organizations and networks are putting into place in terms of engaging the health sector and the social service sector, and that long list of collaborators that Elena mentioned were reported through these different stories. And so I think one of the next steps for that case management group is to really look at what are some of these good models, how can we build from that, and create a resource that would feature how some of that collaboration can be most successful. So that's maybe a recruitment message to get more involved in that work and contribute to it, what's happening in Gabon, and then learn from others in other countries as well. And Salim, I don't know if you have anything to add to that one, too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amy. I have nothing to say.
And then maybe one final question. We're running out of time. If we weren't able to address your questions, feel free to email us. The email is on the screen. But with the ratio of social workers and social service workers available to address these issues to the population facing them, what can we do to encourage more people to take up this profession?
Is that one for me?
Yeah, I guess so. Or anyone.
Okay. All right. Yeah, and Salim, also, if you have anything to add from how recruitment of social workers and social service workers is proceeding in Pakistan, that would be great to add to it. But just maybe broadly looking across a number of different countries, a number of places are looking at how to increase recruitment to the field. A lot of it is associated with kind of public perceptions of the work, which, that is one of the goals of this work and this report, is to help highlight the critical importance of this work, and that it is a valuable skill area, that it takes certain skills that people need to study, and to really address these very complex issues that communities face. So really focusing on improving public perception, but also really making sure that workers are well resourced, that there's enough funding to hire the right amount of workers, that you're addressing burnout and some of the things that cause high turnover rates and low retention. All of these things really help making sure that there's accessibility to training, that it's not just really high quality training in the capital, but that it's available throughout the country. That there is in a lot of our mapping studies, we look at the pipeline of workers and look at master's and PhD programs, so that there are professors available to teach bachelor students, for example, and really looking at the pipeline of workers that's created through different levels of education. So there are a number of areas, I think.
Thank you, Amy. And we're about out of time. Again, if we weren't able to answer your question, feel free to email us. We'd be happy to follow up on additional questions related to the data and implications and way forward. So with that, we're going to wrap up our webinar. If you would like to join the Alliance and you haven't already done so, you can become a member. It's a free membership, and you will receive additional updates and notices from us about future webinars and ways to interact with global colleagues. We also would like to invite you to register to either attend in person or online through the live webcast, the 5th Annual Social Service Workforce Strengthening Symposium on May 8th. And we will further discuss some of the implications and findings from the report, as well as share stories from 3 different countries, or feature 3 different country panels, and how they are enacting new policies to strengthen the workforce and address address some of these issues. And finally, as we mentioned, the full summary and recording of this webinar will be available, and an email will be sent when it is posted online. So thank you all again for joining, and we look forward to further engaging with you and being in touch. Have a great afternoon or evening or morning, depending where you are. Thank you again. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Thank you.
Nicole, Elena, and Salim.
Thank you so much, Abby, for providing me opportunity to share the experience and learn from you people as well.